Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Mark always believed his life was in perfect harmony. His marriage with Laura seemed solid, predictable, comfortable. Every morning, she left the house before him, claiming she liked to avoid heavy traffic, while he had a more flexible and calm routine. She would leave smiling, with a quick kiss, grab her bag, and go away, just like she had been doing for years, and he never imagined that this routine hid something that would change everything. For him, there was no reason to be suspicious. It was just another one of those silent repetitions of daily life, which you don't even realize is happening anymore. That morning, Mark was having his coffee when the phone rang. It was Peter, his boss, with whom he had maintained a good relationship for a long time. Peter explained that he had suffered a small domestic accident, had hurt his foot, and because of that, couldn't drive. He asked, in a somewhat awkward tone, if Mark could stop by his house to pick him up for work. Without thinking twice, Mark answered yes. He thought it would be an opportunity to help his boss and also get out of his usual routine. He finished his coffee, grabbed the car keys, and went out. He drove to the neighborhood where Peter lived, a place he didn't usually visit but knew superficially. As soon as he parked in front of the house, he waited patiently. He looked around distractedly while fiddling with his phone and listening to some random music on the radio. Then, all of a sudden, a scene caught his attention and made his stomach tighten. On the other side of the street, a door opened, and without believing what he was seeing, Laura came out quickly, looked left and right, and rushed into her car, speeding off. For a few seconds, Mark was completely paralyzed. He couldn't understand what he had just witnessed. His mind was searching for quick explanations, but none seemed plausible. He watched as her car disappeared in the distance, his heart beating faster than normal. He took a deep breath, trying to find logic in that situation, while doubt settled inside him like a shadow. His first impulse was to pick up his phone and call Laura, ask her what she was doing there, but as soon as he held the device, he hesitated. He looked at the screen for a few seconds without the courage to press the call button. He thought, if it's what I'm thinking, she'll deny it, she'll come up with some excuse. And that possibility made him stop the movement. He put the phone back in his pocket, lowered his head, and let out a long sigh. For the first time, he realized that maybe it was better not to act impulsively. He needed something more, he needed certainty. He decided, right then, that he wouldn't say anything, wouldn't confront anyone. He would just observe. Meanwhile, Peter appeared limping at the door, leaning on an improvised cane. Mark opened the car door, went to him, offered help getting in, and, with a slightly embarrassed smile, Peter thanked him for the ride. During the trip to work, Peter talked about the pain in his foot, how he felt hindered by depending on others, and even made a few jokes to lighten the tension. Mark faked laughter, but his mind was elsewhere. Peter's words seemed like distant noise, while his mind replayed, on loop, the scene of Laura coming out of that unknown house. He couldn't get the image of her looking left and right out of his head, as if making sure no one saw her. That disturbed him more than anything else. He started remembering other small things, the days when she left more dressed up than usual, the times she seemed to avoid answering simple questions, the moments when she said she needed to stay longer at work. Things that, until that day, he had considered normal, typical of a couple who had been together for years. But now, everything seemed to take on a different meaning. Every gesture, every word, every silence. Mark was driving, but inside, he felt like he was being led down a road he never wanted to travel. When he parked at the office, Peter thanked him again, and just before getting out of the car, casually asked if Mark could do the same the next day. Mark answered yes, without thinking much. He just nodded and smiled automatically, like someone trying to seem natural, but already being consumed by a quiet anguish he himself wasn't exactly sure how to name. The next morning, Mark woke up earlier than usual. He had barely slept. He spent the night tossing and turning in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, reliving the scene he had witnessed the day before. Laura's face rushing out of that unfamiliar house wouldn't leave his head. The image of her looking quickly from side to side, as if checking that no one saw her, was carved into his memory like an unavoidable mark. He didn't want to create unfounded theories, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that something serious was happening. He left the house with slow steps, his stomach tied up, and a strange feeling, like his own routine was no longer a safe space, but rather a hostile territory where any move could confirm a fear he'd rather not have. He drove to Peter's house, paying attention to everything, like someone searching for hidden signals in the corners of the city. He parked in the same spot, took a deep breath, adjusted the rearview mirror, and waited, with restless eyes scanning every detail of the surroundings. This time, Laura's car didn't appear. He waited until Peter came out limping and got into the car, thanking him for the help, but Mark barely heard what his boss was saying. His attention was completely focused on the other side of the street. He was watching the house from which Laura had come out the previous day, as if at any moment she might appear again. But nothing happened. No unusual movements, no familiar presence. Just emptiness, which seemed to mock him, as if the absence of any sign was more disturbing than the confirmation of an affair. On the way to work, Peter, unaware of the emotional turmoil of Mark, started chatting about trivial things: football, a new company project, a TV series he had started watching. Mark responded with monosyllables, smiling automatically, but his head was completely taken over by that doubt that seemed to grow with each passing minute, suffocating any attempt to think about anything else. What was Laura doing in that house? Why did she leave like that? And, more anguishing, who else knew about it? The next day, Mark repeated the same ritual. He woke up early, left quietly, parked in the same spot, and waited. And once again, Laura didn't show up. Her car didn't even pass by the street. Peter came out, limping a little less, and got into the car with the same kindness as always, thanking him for the help and commenting that, thank God, his recovery was going fast. Mark tried to smile, but inside, he felt increasingly suffocated. Laura's silence, her absence from that place, the days piling up without answers, all of it began to erode his confidence and, at the same time, fueled the need to discover the truth. On Thursday, Mark no longer expected big changes, but still repeated the same route, like someone following a trail that doesn't know where it leads, but can't abandon. Once again, there were no unusual movements. Peter, this time, seemed cheerful, commenting that that would probably be the penultimate day of the ride. He laughed, saying that he could already stand on his foot and that, on Monday, he would probably return to driving. Mark only agreed with a discreet gesture, but his thoughts were far away. It was then that, during the trip, Peter casually mentioned that Friday would be the last day of the ride. A simple sentence, but for Mark, it sounded like a silent ultimatum: either he would discover what he needed, or perhaps he would never have the chance again. The tension within him increased even more. That doubt, which initially seemed a fleeting thought, now became a silent obsession, a desperate desire for answers. Mark spent the rest of that day restless, struggling to focus at work, making simple mistakes, replying to emails mechanically, avoiding even talking to colleagues. Time seemed to drag cruelly, as if each second was a torture reinforcing his powerlessness in a situation he hadn't chosen to live, but from which he could no longer escape. More than ever, he knew he had to wait until Friday. It was his chance. The last chance. And even though he didn't know exactly what he would find, he was determined to go through with it. On Friday, Laura left home as usual. She gave him a quick kiss, grabbed the car keys, and left. The scene was identical to dozens, maybe hundreds of times that had repeated over the past years. She didn't seem to suspect anything, smiled slightly, adjusted her hair, and followed her path. Mark observed everything, without letting the storm forming inside him show. He waited 20 minutes, grabbed the car keys, and left, driving directly to Peter's house, just like he had done in the previous days. The journey seemed shorter that day, perhaps due to the anxiety eating at his patience or the intense desire to end that doubt. He parked in the same spot and then noticed Laura's car was parked across the street, exactly in the same place as before, as if it were part of a rehearsed choreography. Mark's chest tightened, his fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly while he took a deep breath, trying to maintain control over himself, over what might happen next. The minutes dragged on. He stayed there, silent, observing, with his eyes fixed on the entrance of that house that, for him, was just another unimportant building until a few days ago. But now, that place represented everything he needed to know. Time passed without anything happening, until suddenly, the door opened and Laura appeared. She came out just like she had before, hurried, discreet, but this time she wasn't alone. Next to her walked a man Mark had never seen before. That man approached, placed his hand on her waist with intimacy that isn't built in days or weeks, but reveals years of history, or at least a strong connection. They walked together to Laura's car, and before she got in, they kissed. It wasn't a quick kiss, nor a timid gesture. It was a kiss full of desire, from someone involved in something more than just a casual meeting. Mark felt his stomach churn. For a moment, his breathing failed, as if air simply refused to enter. His hands began to sweat, and thoughts collided, but he didn't let despair take over. He grabbed his phone firmly, and with trembling hands, recorded the scene. He needed proof, not as revenge, but as the only concrete evidence that he wasn't imagining things in his head. Laura got into the car and drove away, with the man staying on the sidewalk, watching her leave with a satisfied smile. Mark remained still, frozen, processing what he had just witnessed. Every second of that scene seemed engraved in his memory, as if it would never fade. What destroyed him most wasn't the kiss itself, but realizing that Laura had a hidden life, a parallel story he had never suspected existed. A carefully built routine to look normal, but now revealing its true face cruelly and implacably. At that moment, Peter came out of the house, leaning slightly against the wall before walking with difficulty toward Mark's car. He opened the passenger door and got in, thanking him, as always, for the ride. Mark just nodded, unable to completely hide the state of shock he was in. He drove in silence while Peter talked about the end of the need for a ride, about how he was recovering and about plans to start driving again the following week. Mark listened to Peter's words, but they made no sense at that moment. He barely distinguished the sound of his boss's voice, because his mind was stuck in the image of Laura in another man's arms, on a Friday morning, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The road seemed long, and each kilometer traveled only reinforced the certainty that his life, until then so predictable, had changed forever. Mark kept driving, but inside, everything was already paralyzed. What hurt the most wasn't the infidelity itself, but realizing that Laura had been able to smile, to leave the house every day with that same mechanical kiss, while hiding something so deep. He, who had always believed in trust and routine, now found himself facing the harshest reality. Love often unravels in silence, in small gestures that seem harmless, but that hide truths capable of destroying years of history. That night, Mark arrived home before Laura, something that rarely happened. He spent the entire day ruminating on what he had seen, the video still fresh on his phone, the image of Laura kissing another man stuck in his mind like a wound he couldn't and didn't want to ignore. He knew that this would be one of the hardest conversations of his life, but he also had the certainty that it had to happen. He entered the house with firm steps, sat on the couch, and waited, unsure of how to conduct the situation. There was no script, no formula to confront someone with such clear evidence. Hours later, Laura arrived as if it were just another ordinary Friday. She opened the door, dropped her bag in the same place as always, and headed toward Mark with that automatic smile, expecting a banal comment about the day or, at most, an invitation to dinner. He observed her for a few seconds, feeling the pain pressing even harder in his chest, and then, without beating around the bush, asked her to sit down. The tone of his voice made her stop, realizing something strange was in the air, something that interrupted any attempt to pretend normality. Mark took out his phone, opened the video, and played it in front of her, without saying a word. Laura looked, first with a curious gaze, then with wide-eyed surprise, until, when she saw herself on the screen, kissing the other man, her whole body seemed to lose strength. She put her hands to her face and started crying compulsively, unable to say anything, unable to deny what was so clearly visible there, recorded, registered, impossible to erase. Mark remained silent, giving her the time she needed to process what had just happened, but inside, he felt completely exhausted. When she finally managed to breathe between sobs, Mark spoke directly, asking her to explain everything, without detours, without lies, without empty justifications. Laura wiped her tears, tried to recompose herself, and, with a trembling voice, confessed. She said that the man was her ex-boyfriend, someone with whom she had lived an intense story in her adolescence, who then left the city and was gone for years, but who had recently returned, reigniting feelings she believed were buried in the past. She admitted that, in the last few months, she had been meeting him, trying to understand what she still felt, but that she had never had the courage to tell the truth. Mark listened to every word without interrupting, without raising his voice, but feeling each one like blades piercing his skin. He didn't ask for details, nor did he want to know when or how it had started, because, at that moment, it didn't matter anymore. The essential thing had been said: she betrayed him, lied, built a parallel life while maintaining the appearance of a solid marriage. When Laura finished speaking, Mark stood up calmly, went to the bedroom, and started packing his bags, taking only the essentials, without making a scene, without arguing. Laura stayed in the living room, crying, begging him to reconsider, saying she loved him, that it didn't have to mean the end. Mark, with a heavy heart, replied that he needed time, needed to step away to understand what he wanted from his own life, but that, at that moment, the only thing he could do was leave. He grabbed the bags, crossed the room without looking back, and left. He drove to a nearby hotel, checked in, went into the room, and as soon as he closed the door, sat on the bed, taking a deep breath, feeling exhaustion take over his body and mind. The next day, while having breakfast at the hotel, he decided he needed to tell someone, so he called Peter, whose friendship had strengthened in those last few days, and told him what had happened. He called him and asked them to meet quickly. Peter accepted, and a few minutes later, they were face to face. Mark told everything, from the day he saw Laura leaving the house to the recording of the kiss and the confession. Peter was silent for a while, listening attentively, with a serious expression. Then he took a deep breath and released the sentence that Mark could never have predicted: the man Laura was seeing was his nephew, who had just returned to the city after years traveling around the world. Mark was paralyzed when he heard that. Peter explained that the nephew lived exactly in the house across from his, the same one where Mark had seen Laura entering and leaving several times. He said that, in fact, he had considered hiring the young man to work at the company, but that, given the situation, for Mark's sake, he would give it up. He apologized, said he could never have imagined that something like this was happening so close, that he felt bad for what Mark was going through. Mark just thanked him, unable to say much, absorbing yet another piece of information that added even more weight to everything he was already experiencing. He stayed there for a few minutes, looking at Peter, thinking about how life can play incredible tricks, how everything can change overnight, and how sometimes the biggest truths emerge from the most mundane encounters, like a simple ride that he had never imagined would change his story forever. The following weeks were a test of emotional endurance for Mark. He spent the first few days isolated in the hotel, going out only for essentials, without the will to see anyone, avoiding any place that could remind him of Laura or of everything they had built together. The marriage, which until then had seemed solid, collapsed like a house of cards. The betrayal was just the final blow of a series of silences, neglects, and lies that he hadn't recognized in time. No matter how much he tried to understand how things had reached that point, the only conclusion he could reach was that sometimes life takes care of showing us what we avoid seeing. Laura sent some messages, tried calling, sent voice notes asking for a chance to talk in person, but Mark preferred to keep his distance. He felt there was nothing left to say, not after everything he had seen, not after the confession. The image of her kissing another man still invaded his thoughts in moments of distraction, like an annoying memory that insisted on staying. He knew that moving on would be a long process, but he also understood that he needed to start, even if slowly, one step at a time. The separation was inevitable. Without arguments, without drama, just mutual recognition that there was no sense in continuing. Laura eventually moved out of the house they had shared and moved in with the man she had cheated on Mark with, none other than Peter's nephew. The irony of that situation seemed like a poorly written script, a cruel coincidence that he could never have foreseen. For a while, Mark thought maybe they would live happily, that Laura had chosen a new path and that, despite the pain, he should accept and move forward. But in less than a month, the news that reached him was completely different from what he had imagined. Laura, that same woman who seemed to have found a new love, had caught Peter's nephew with another woman, in the same neighborhood, in a situation just as obvious as the one Mark had recorded on his phone weeks earlier. The betrayal repeated itself, now against her, and the relationship Laura believed would be her new chance ended quickly and humiliatingly. When Mark heard that, he felt a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't joy at someone else's misfortune, nor satisfaction at seeing her suffer. It was more of a quiet relief, like someone realizing that certain things in life happen not as punishment, but as part of an inevitable cycle, a reflection of the choices each person makes. He never wished for revenge, but life somehow showed Laura the same pain he had experienced. Meanwhile, Mark continued his path. He stayed temporarily in the hotel until he found a small apartment where he could start anew. He changed some habits, reconnected with old friendships he had set aside during the marriage, and gradually rebuilt his self-confidence. He didn't allow himself to fall into the trap of generalizing love or believing that everyone cheats. On the contrary, he used that experience to mature and understand that although we can't always control what others do, we are fully responsible for how we react. Over time, he freed himself from resentment, accepted the past, and began looking to the future with more lightness. He no longer felt anger toward Laura, nor resentment toward Peter or anyone else involved in that situation. He understood that the choices of others belonged to them, and that his mission was to take care of himself, move forward, and allow himself to be happy again, without carrying the weight of a story that, although painful, served as a watershed in his life. The greatest lesson Mark learned was simple: when the truth appears, it may destroy what seemed unshakable, but it also opens space for something new and more genuine to arise, even if at first it seems impossible to believe. Suspicious of your wife or daughter-in-law? Don't go through what we saw in the video. Check the link in the comments and get the ebook with valuable tips and investigator-approved sites to clear your doubts. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.